being blighted or substandard and qualify for within a TIF district. They want to know that the boundaries of the property that's included within a TIF district or redevelopment district has improvements on them, and that those improvements are substandard. So, just by looking at that map in the previous parcel, or of the map of the parcels, you can see that every one of the parcels within the TIF district are occupied either by buildings or parking lots or some sort of other improvement. In addition to that, more than 50% of the buildings within the TIF district have to be deemed to be structurally substandard, which is a degree structurally substandard is a degree requiring substantial renovation or clearance. So again, that a property is defined as structurally substandard if the cost of bringing that existing building into compliance with current building codes is greater than the 15% of the cost of constructing a new structure of that same type. So in this case, the building that was evaluated was the Shopco building. So the cost of bringing the Shopco building into compliance with current code is greater than 15% of the cost of constructing that building from a new state. So that allows that building to be considered to be or qualified as structurally substandard. Sometimes you hear this referred to as a blighted building. It's not quite blight in the traditional definition, but it's this structurally substandard definition is what is referenced within TIF statute. So the property within a TIF district will be inspected to determine that qualification. And at the end of the TIF plan, the executive summary from a study prepared by LHB Engineering Company identifies that property was inspected and that it was determined to qualify as structurally substandard. So a redevelopment TIF district allows for 25% of the TIF funds to be spent on public improvements or administrative costs outside of the TIF district area. In this case, we're proposing that all of it would be spent on improvements within the boundaries of the TIF district, aside from the city's 10%. And then additionally, there's known as what's called the 90% test with a redevelopment district. So that requires that 90% of the proposed TIF revenue be used to remove the conditions that allowed that property to be considered blighted. So that includes costs associated with acquiring the property, demolition, clearing of land, installation of utilities, roads, sidewalks, and parking facilities, as well as potentially the cost of constructing the new building on that. So we have to, the idea behind this 90% test from the statutory standpoint is they want to make sure that we're using TIF to remediate the things that allow the property to be blighted and to make this specific development allow it to be redeveloped, as opposed to trying to capture increment from this, spend it somewhere else, or spend it on something that doesn't have a direct nexus to the property. So the idea with this test is to really focus the use of TIF on the project itself, as opposed to trying to find other creative uses for it. So again, the city is eligible to receive administrative expenses, or the city's administrative expenses are eligible under that 90% test. So again, the maximum term for duration of a redevelopment TIF district is 25 years from the receipt of first income, or the city's administrative expenses are eligible under that 90% test. So again, the maximum term for duration of a redevelopment TIF district is 25 years from the receipt of first increment, or 26 total years. So when we talk about TIF districts and funding of TIF improvements, we have to talk about how those improvements are being funded, because TIF is fundamentally a future source of revenue. TIF is revenue that's not going to be in place today. It's going to be in place and generated in the subsequent years after the new development happens. So the new development's going to pay its property taxes just as they would if they were inside or outside of a TIF district. They're about how those improvements are being funded, because TIF is fundamentally a future source of revenue. TIF is revenue that's not going to be in place today. It's going to be in place and generate property tax bill will be exactly the same, and they'll be paying significant taxes that aren't even eligible to be captured by TIF, including state property taxes on the commercial portion in the subsequent years after the new development happens. So the new development's going to pay its property taxes just as they would if they were inside or outside of a TIF district. But fundamentally it's a future revenue stream. But when we're talking about a TIF district and we're talking about the project costs that are being funded by that TIF district, we're talking about property tax bill will be exactly the same, and they'll be paying significant taxes that aren't even eligible to be captured by TIF, including state property taxes on the commercial portion, costs that are being incurred today. So how do we bridge that gap between future revenues and costs that are being incurred today? And there's two really fundamental, but fundamentally it's a future revenue stream. But when we're talking about a TIF district and we're talking about the project costs that are being funded by that TIF district, we're talking about ways to do that. The first is to do it on a pay-as-you-go basis, which is what's being proposed here. On a pay-as-you-go TIF district, the developer is responsible for funding all costs that are being incurred today. So how do we bridge that gap between future revenues and costs that are being incurred today? There's two really fundamental, all those public improvements today out of pocket from their own dollars. So when we're talking about later when we talk about the development agreement, we talk about the TIF assistance amount, ways to do that. The first is to do it on a pay-as-you-go basis, which is what's being proposed here. On a pay-as-you-go TIF district, the developer is responsible for funding all. That is the amount that the developer is going to have to fund themselves, either from their own funds or from private borrowing, and then they will be reimbursed over time by the tax increment revenue, all those public improvements today out of pocket from their own dollars. So when we're talking about later when we talk about the development agreement, we talk about the TIF assistance amount. That is the amount that the developer is going to have to fund themselves, either from their own funds or from private borrowing, and then they will be reimbursed over time by the tax increment revenue that's generated. So over the 26 potential years of a TIF district, they would get reimbursed based on the tax increment that's generated each year on a pay-as-you-go basis. And the reimbursement of that pay-as-you-go note is limited only to the amount of TIF revenue that is collected. The big difference between the two of these is the ACEs, and the reimbursement of that pay-as-you-go note is limited only to the amount of TIF revenue that is collected. The big difference between the two of these is the second one is the GO tax increment bonds, which is in certain circumstances, if the cities were to so choose, they could choose to issue debt now and fund the project costs themselves, and then use the future tax increment revenue to pay back the debt service on those bonds. Debt now and fund the project costs themselves, and then use the future tax increment revenue to pay back the debt service on those bonds. The big difference between the two of these is where does the risk profile fall? With the pay-as-you-go TIF district, the developer is funding the improvements out of pocket and upfront, and they're only being reimbursed to the extent that tax increment revenue is generated. With a GO tax increment bond, the city is funding those costs out of pocket or through the issuance of debt, and they are obligated to make the debt service payments. So on a pay-as-you-go TIF, the risk of the future TIF revenue being less or different than is currently projected, that risk and that repayment risk falls on the developer's shoulders. If the TIF comes in at a lower rate, say there's a change in property tax collection systems, or the way property taxes are calculated in Minnesota, or market values are different, for any number of reasons, TIF revenue could be less than was currently projected. If it is less, that risk falls on the developer, and the city would have no obligation to make them whole if that TIF revenue comes in at a lesser rate than currently projected. If it was a tax increment bond, that risk would then fall on the city's shoulder if that revenue came in at a lesser amount. The city would have to pay out of pocket to make up any difference in that TIF revenue. So the majority of the tax increment districts we do are pay-as-you-go because it puts all that risk on the developer, and it requires the developer to fund those costs today out of pocket and then get reimbursed over time to the extent that tax increment revenue is generated. So Bill hit pretty good, most of the high points on the TIF district or the project for the proposed TIF district, but I'll cover them again real quick. It's a mixed-use, two-phase development that proposes the creation of two four-story buildings containing first-floor retail and then market-rate apartments on floors 2 to 4. The first phase would be 7,500 square feet of retail and then 33 apartments. The second phase would be 4,700 square feet of retail and 36 apartments. The proposed completion of the first phase is in 2022, and the estimated initiation of development for the first phase is in 2021. The second phase has a proposed completion date requirement of 2025 within the development agreement. The developer has some flexibility within the development agreement as to when they initiate that development, but the development has to be completed by the end of 2025 to be in accordance with the development agreement. So we focus on the completion dates within this PowerPoint and then as it relates to the projection of the future tax increment revenues. The total estimated market value, so ultimately the taxes and the TIF revenue that are going to be generated within the development are based off of this assumed post-development value of the project after completion. So the county assessor provided an estimate for the total market value after the completion of both phases of $7,347,700. And within the TIF revenue projections, we have assumed a small inflation assumption of 1.5% of market value inflation each year of the TIF plan. And again, if that revenue does, or that market value does not inflate at that rate as projected within the TIF plan, it would result in a shortfall of TIF revenue, which would be risk that would be borne by the developer and not by the city. If that revenue inflates if that market value inflates at a greater rate and it pays off that principal amount faster, it would shorten the overall term of the district, which would be a benefit to the city. Similarly, if the total post-development market value is greater than 7.3 million, it would create more TIF revenue than projected, which would pay off that note faster and again shorten the overall term of the district. So we want to be conservative when we're estimating this post-development market value, because if it comes in higher, it's to everyone's benefit as it relates to the city's perspective, because it would generate more TIF revenue faster, paying off that note quicker, and then putting the property back on the general tax base earlier than projected. So when we talk about the creation of a TIF district, there's a statutory finding that has to be made that the proposed development, in the opinion of the city, would not reasonably be expected to occur solely through private investment within the reasonably foreseeable future. This is what's known as the but-for test. So essentially, it's that the proposed development would not occur but for the use of tax increment financing. The important philosophy behind this but-for finding is that it provides a foundation for the use of the incentive and the capture of that future tax revenue, because if we've determined that the proposed development would not occur but for the use of TIF, then we're capturing future tax revenues that are only in place because the tax increment financing was used in the first place. If the TIF was not available to the project would not happen, and therefore those future taxes that are being captured by the TIF district would not be relevant or in place or realized. When we do evaluate the but-for test, we're looking at the proposed development as it's referred to within the TIF plan, with and without the requested assistance. We're not talking about any potential development on the site as part of the analysis. It's specific to the development proposal at hand. So would this proposed development, this two-building mixed-use development, would that occur but for the use of tax increment financing? And then as part of that analysis, that's not necessarily a statutory requirement, but it's good public policy, is answering, the first question is the assistance necessary? And that is the fundamental but-for question. And the second question, that's more of the city policy question and just good public practice, is how much assistance is needed. We want to make sure that when we're using TIF, that A, we're only using it for projects that warrant it, and B, we're not over-incentivizing projects. We don't want to provide more TIF revenue or TIF assistance to a project than is necessary. So the objective from the city is to provide the minimum amount of subsidy required to complete the project, as well as to mitigate the city risk. And we mitigate the city risk by going with the pay-as-you-go proposal as opposed to an upfront financing by the city. So how do we make that but-for finding? That but-for finding is a bit of an esoteric question in and of its own, but there are ways that we can objectively answer that question. And we do that by preparing a financial analysis of the project and looking at ultimately what the developer's rate of return would be on their investment with and without the requested TIF assistance. So the measure that we use is what's known as the internal rate of return analysis, which is a way of measuring the overall return to the developer over the period, over a 14-year period in this case, of the operation of the district. So this internal rate of return allows us to realize project what would be the potential return on investment to the developer with abatement or with assistance, and what would it be without. And if the rate of return without the assistance is insufficient to warrant, naturally a risky investment such as real estate investment, then we can make that determination that the project would be unlikely to occur without the requested assistance. So it provides us a measure and a way of answering that somewhat esoteric but-for question on an objective basis, on the basis of a financial analysis. So as part of that, we evaluated the developer's assumptions for cost and operating revenues. We determined they were reasonable. We want to make sure that we're looking at reasonable and likely assumptions, or assumptions that are likely to be incurred. We want to make sure that those are reasonable and not overstated to try to show a need that might not be present. So once we did that, we made sure that the underlying assumptions were reasonable. We calculated an unleveraged internal rate of return for the project without TIF and one with TIF. Without TIF, it's 5.49%, and then with TIF, it's 6.73%. To analyze if those returns are reasonable, we look at what's known as the Price Waterhouse Cooper, or PwC, Real Estate Investor Survey. So this is a national survey of real estate investors that's put out quarterly each year that identifies national development return on investment targets by developers nationally. So for the investment in a market rate housing apartment project, that survey identifies a target benchmark for returns of 6.83. So we can see that the developer's return with TIF of 6.73 is, almost right in line with that third-party benchmark that we looked at. And without assistance, it's at 5.49%, which is, might not look like a big difference between those two numbers, but it's actually a 22% delta between the two of them if you were to look at the rate of change necessary to go from 5.49 to 6.73. So this return analysis allows us to make that but-for finding. The additional 5.49 to 6.73. So this return analysis allows us to make that but-for finding. The additional analysis that we did is we also looked at another measure, what's known as the debt coverage ratio. So whenever a developer is seeking private financing for a development, they have to show or illustrate to their lender that there's a significant amount of revenue, operating revenue, that exceeds whatever the anticipated borrowing or debt service would be on their anticipated financing. The lender wants to know that there's more revenue than debt, and that revenue is greater than debt by a specific ratio.
We already did the budget.
So we can use that ratio with and without the projected TIF to see if, to have another measure for making that but-for finding. So at a stabilized project without TIF, that debt coverage ratio is only 1.12. With TIF, that projected debt coverage ratio is 1.28. A typical lending threshold is about from 1.2 to 1.25, if not greater, but the lowest you would typically see is about a 1.2 coverage ratio that a lender is going to want to see. So again, this is another measure that allows us to make that but-for finding. So when we combine both that IRR analysis as well as this debt coverage ratio test, both of those allow us to illustrate that the project is unlikely to proceed but for the requested TIF assistance. So the TIF plan provides the authorization for the city to enter into future obligations. The TIF plan in and of itself doesn't obligate the city to do necessarily anything, but it does provide them with the authority to enter into future obligations, which is what the development agreement would then be. That development agreement, the pay-as-you-go note within that development agreement, would be the actual obligation that the city would be entering into. The TIF plan just gives the city the authority to enter into that. Within the TIF plan, we have to identify an overall budget for the use of TIF within the TIF district and the various categories that it would go towards. The TIF plan budget is based off the full 26-year maximum duration of the TIF district. So these amounts are actually greater than what would potentially be used by the TIF district if the TIF district was ended early. When the TIF district has an obligation that ends earlier than the maximum duration of the TIF district, which we can talk about the duration of this obligation, potential obligation, once that obligation is fulfilled, the TIF district actually has to be decertified earlier. So this TIF district is likely to be decertified earlier than 26 years, but for maximum flexibility within the TIF plan, we base the budget off the full revenues generated over the 26 years. So this TIF plan authorizes up to $1.2 million to be used to reimburse the developer for TIF eligible costs that they would be incurring up front, and again, they would be reimbursed this amount over time. Additionally, the developer would be eligible to be reimbursed for their carrying expense as it relates to them incurring these costs. The developer has to fund these costs out of pocket and up front, but they're not going to be repaid for over a period of up to 20 total years. So they are likely to incur a carrying cost as it relates to their private financing of these costs. So we've also estimated a potential pay-as-you-go note interest payment amount that the developer will be eligible to receive reimbursement for as well. In addition, the city is able to retain up to 10% of the tax increment revenue for their administrative expenses related to the administration of the district. Since we're talking about a 20-year pay-as-you-go note, but a 26-year TIF district, for purposes of estimating this plan, we have a column for other eligible TIF uses that would be at the city's discretion if they had any other future potential obligations. this is that maximum flexibility that we've drafted the TIF plan around, is this final line item. Ultimately, or most likely, unless the city were to enter into some other obligation, this budget authority would not be utilized, and the actual TIF revenue generated or expenditures of the district would be less by this line item. So this is our flexibility that's based off of proposing a TIF plan that has 26 years versus a TIF obligation that's only 20 years. And then finally, this is the TIF plan again projects the full maximum 26 years of revenue, which is over the 26-year life of the district, is projected to be a little more than $3.1 million. Again, this is all subject to future tax rates, future market values. You know, we're almost certain that the TIF revenue, the actual TIF revenue, will be somewhat different than what is projected within this plan because tax rates change ever so slightly year by year. So ultimately, this is our budget authority, but the actual TIF revenues will be based on the market value that's generated by the project and the tax rates that are in place at the time the TIF district was created. So finally, the TIF plan provides the authorization to enter into obligations of the city. That obligation that the city would be entering into is that proposed development agreement. And we want to hit on a couple of the development agreement points, and then we'll turn it over for questions. So the development agreement is the obligation that the city would be entering into, and it's where the rhetorical rubber meets the road as it relates to the actual use of the TIF dollars and the actual implementation of the use of those TIF dollars. So again, the development agreement contemplates reimbursing the developer for their incurring initially out of pocket $1,201,621 in TIF eligible expenses. The developer would be reimbursed on a pay-as-you-go basis from generated TIF revenue each year up to that principal amount. In addition, they would be eligible to receive interest-carrying expenses related to their incurring of $1.2 million at the lesser of either 4.25% or their actual cost of financing. So when the TIF note is issued, the developer will submit their financing plan for the first phase, and if the interest on that first phase construction is less than 4.25%, the interest rate that the note would be reimbursed at would be the lesser of that amount. If it's greater than 4.25%, the interest rate would be capped at 4.25%. One of the things that is unique about this project is that it's two phases. So until initiation of construction is started on the second phase, the developer is only able to receive reimbursement for the demolition and costs associated with the demolition of the shopco. Once the phase 2 project is initiated, they'd be eligible to receive reimbursement for costs associated with the construction of the second phase. But they're only, the only TIF that they would be eligible to be reimbursed for between the construction or the completion of the first phase and the initiation of the phase 2 construction is the demolition. If the phase 2 construction is not completed by the end of 2025, the developer will cease to receive TIF reimbursement, and they would be in default per the terms of the agreement. So if the second phase construction or the second building is not completed for construction by the end of 2025, the developer would be in default of the agreement. So, and they would not even be eligible to receive reimbursement for the demolition if the phase 2 project is not completed by the end of 2025, because they would be in default. So the ability to receive the full amount of the tax increment revenue and the reimbursement for the $1.2 million in principal costs is largely contingent upon the completion, or entirely contingent upon the completion of the second phase of development. So a couple final more terms are that the reimbursement of the TIF note will occur from 90% of the generated or captured tax increment. So the developer and the properties will pay their taxes as normal. The portion that is eligible to be captured by TIF will be captured by the county, sent back to the city, and then the city would take 90% of that revenue that's received twice annually, and they would make payments to the developer against the repayment of that $1.2 million in principal. And the developer would receive payment each year of a principal and interest amount. And ultimately, over the term of the pay-as-you-go note, over 20 years, that $1.2 million would either be fully repaid by TIF, or if the TIF revenue is insufficient to fully repay that $1.2 million plus interest, the city would have zero obligation to satisfy any shortfall in the event that TIF revenue is less. If the TIF revenue comes in faster, that $1.2 million and the interest associated with it would be repaid faster, and there would be less interest expense incurred or reimbursed on the repayment of that 1.2 because it was repaid over a faster period. So again, the developer is responsible for initially funding the $1.2 million in eligible expenditures. The city is not making any expenditures, any cost or expenses incurred by the city out of pocket. The developer is incurring all of those costs initially, and the city's only obligation is to make payments to the developer based off the generated tax increment revenue to the extent that it's generated. Again, if that revenue is less, the developer is the one that bears that risk, and they'd be the one that would not be fully reimbursed for their incurring of cost. There's no direct upfront funding of costs by the city in this case at all. So again, the city only provides reimbursement to the extent that TIF revenue is generated on a pay-as-you-go basis, and it's only for a period of 20 years. This Tif Note could be in place for a period of up to 26 years, but based on our but-for review and our review of the rate of return with assistance, we found that a 20-year note would be sufficient to make the project feasible. So again, we reduced the overall total amount of assistance from the maximum potential of the district and left it at the 1.2 and left the pay-as-you-go note term at 20 years to try to make sure that we're not providing any more assistance than is necessary for this project and get this project back in the general tax base as quickly as possible. So with that, the next steps, if you so choose, would be to approve the resolution modifying the development district, which also approves the creation of the TIF district and approves the entering into the TIF development agreement. So with that, I'll turn it over, stop screen sharing, and turn it over for any questions.
Thank you, Tom. And with that, I know that there are a number of people joining us this evening. We're going to open the public hearing up to the public for any comments, and then we'll bring it back to the council for discussion. So with that, we're going to, I will open the public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak to the proposed tax increment financing District 413 to Rivers Edge Development, please identify yourself and state your comments for the record.
Good evening, Council and Mayor. Annie Deckert, Greater Fergus Falls. I'm here tonight to speak in support of this project. My address is 403 South Union, Suite 10. So as you know, our mission at Greater Fergus Falls is to grow the area's business community, and we've been working on this project for over a year now, and I want to thank you so far already for all of your support, from amending the city's ordinance to allow for warehouse temporarily to approving the purchase agreement for the city lot. All of those things are necessary to move this project forward. So this project is going to have a tremendous impact on our business community, not only for providing Class A commercial space, which we have very limited of currently, but it'll also provide at least 60 ADA compliant apartment buildings, which will be permanent residents to be able to support our downtown businesses. And I'm guessing there probably hasn't been new apartments constructed in downtown for quite some time. So tonight, asking for your support in this TIF application. By supporting this project, you're helping fill one of our empty big boxes, providing housing for our community, which is definitely a need in addition to commercial space. You'll also be leveraging public and private investment to really help support the highest and best use of this riverfront property. As Tom explained, utilizing TIF, particularly projects along the river, to really fully capture the highest potential tax base. A lot of times TIF is necessary, which in this instance it is. Then also lastly, you'll be really sending a positive pro-business message to our business community with all the developers and investors that we work with. By supporting this, you really show that you support the growth of our community and the redevelopment of our empty big boxes. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Anyone else from the public like to speak to this issue?
Mark Layton here, Fergus Falls. My purpose of questions is only to determine the total cost to the city. Tom, it was a great opportunity to visit with you and through some emails prior. What happens to who pays higher real estate taxes during the development? Or does it stay at 13,000?
if I could answer that, yes, the developer will be responsible for paying the full property taxes on the development as if it was a regular development. Their property tax bill will get assessed. They'll get assessed to new market value post-development, and they will pay their full property tax amount just the same as they would if the project occurred without the use of TIF or was outside of a TIF district. So they'll be paying their full property tax amount, which includes actually a significant number of taxes that are not captured by TIF. When that tax bill gets paid, the county receives it each year. The county will calculate the amount that's applicable to TIF. They will capture it. They will redirect that back to the city, and then the city would then take those funds and make payments back to the developer against that pay-as-you-go note that the developer would be initially funding themselves.
So looking at your exhibit number 3, you know, the annual gross increment, is that like about a $3.1 million that the total real estate taxes would be on this development?
That would be the
That's the
total tax increment revenue that would be paid over the potential life of the TIF district if it was over the full 26 years. The actual tax bill paid by the developer would be greater because this column is only looking at the TIF portion of property tax. The developer will be paying significantly more taxes each year than is actually being captured or able to be generated as TIF. But yes, over the lifetime of the TIF district, the TIF revenue is projected to be $3.1 million prior to any deductions from the OSA or the state auditor deduction.
So the purpose of TIF, let's just say the developer build this building in 1 year, and it immediately goes to a full value of the 9 million something. They would pay those real estate taxes every year, and then county would, in essence, capture some of that in the TIF, and it would go to the city.
Correct.
And then part of that portion then goes back to the developer and to the tune of what, $1.2 million?
$1.2 million in principal, plus they'd be eligible for reimbursement related to their interest carrying cost on that $1.2 million. So that interest carrying cost will be variable depending on the rate, the actual rate of TIF revenue and the final amount of the interest rate that they get borrow at. But that pay-as-you-go note interest amount allowance within the TIF plan budget is $771,493, which is the maximum that they'd be eligible to be reimbursed for interest.
So what's the total benefit to the developer? $1.2 million.
The total potential plus it'd be $1.2 million in principal, or in net present value is maybe another way of putting it. But the total cash flow that would be potentially used to reimburse that $1.2 million, which would include interest, of potentially up to $771,000, making the total potential revenue going to the developer potentially up to $1.97. So it would be both the principal and interest amounts shown within the TIF plan. And I can share. It's on the. If you look at the TIF plan budget within the TIF district, you can see both the principal amount of 1.2 as well as the interest amount. So that's the maximum amount that would be eligible under each of those categories. Again, that interest amount could potentially be less depending on how revenue gets repaid and if the district gets paid faster.
So can we just summarize? It was $2 million over 20 years.
Roughly, I would say that's the maximum potential. I would say would be slightly less than $2 million. Yes.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I think it is important to remember that that's revenue generated over a 26-year period. So when we talk about the $1.2 million in reimbursable TIF costs, we're really talking about the value of the developer in today's dollars. Obviously, revenue that's generated 20 years from now is not as of value today as revenue that's generated or expenses that are incurred today. So when we talk about the principal amount of the TIF note, we're really talking about the present value of that future revenue stream. So the value of the TIF note in today's dollars is $1.2 million because of the principal or the idea of the time value of money.
I understand. But a typical taxpayer is going to understand it's going to cost the city $100,000 a year in lost revenue.
Potentially.
Had this not been developed in a TIF.
Yes, I hesitate to use the term lost revenue because when we talk about that, because ultimately that goes back to the but-for finding. This project would not be feasible or likely to happen but for the use of the tax increment revenue. So the idea of quantifying those dollars as lost revenue is maybe an inadequate description of that revenue because that revenue is unlikely to be generated or would have been unlikely to have occurred because the project would not have happened because of the but-for finding that we ultimately entered into or made. So I think it's hard to say that that's maybe lost revenue is probably not the most articulate way of describing that future TIF revenue stream due to the but-for finding and if you're confident in that finding.
Well, I respect the developers, don't get me wrong. Anybody can pull numbers out of the hat, but I know a lot of residential rental real estate investors, and they get about 3.5% return on their money before tax depreciation. Go wherever you want to be. I'm not disrespecting the developer at all. I think it's a great program. My only concern is what it's going to cost the city of Fergus Falls in lost revenue. And had John Doe built this facility without TIF versus the next developer doing it in a TIF, it's going to cost the city $2 million over 25 years. $100,000 a year.
Thank you, Mr. Layton. Is there anyone else who would like to address the council during this public hearing before we close the public hearing and bring it back to the council?
If I could point out one thing as it relates to the TIF revenue.
Sure, Tom.
The city's tax rate is only a portion of the TIF applicable tax rate. So the dollars that are applicable to the city's tax rate is about 44% of the overall TIF revenue. So the other dollars that are being captured as TIF revenue are taxes that would actually be applicable to the county and the school district. From the city's perspective, the revenue that's not the city would not be benefiting from as a result of the TIF district is about, I want to say, 44% of the overall TIF revenue. So I think it's worth remembering that the TIF revenue that's applicable to the city's tax dollars is only a portion of the overall TIF revenue.
Thank you, Tom. Anyone else like to address the council before we close the public hearing?
Mr. Mayor, I would like to comment, Andrew Yagi, 1916 Deer Valley Road in Fergus Falls. And Tom, I just want to say thanks. Every time I think I see you present on TIF, I learn a few more tidbits. Well done. So first of all, I've lived in Fergus Falls almost 10 years, and it seems to me that this is probably the first big development project that has happened in about a decade. And so I commend the developers, for going out, for taking the risk, and just awesome to really see a big box site turned into something that not only helps revitalize the downtown, but also ties into the downtown riverfront, which we know the river is a huge feature of our beautiful city. I also support the project because I think that, as Tom exhibited, obviously the tax base compared to what it is existing is going to be vastly increased. And in addition, it's very evident learning about the but-for and especially the debt coverage ratio, realizing that but-for without the TIF, the developers would be sitting at about 1.12, probably not making it possible. So I would support it as a resident of Fergus Falls. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone else before we close the public hearing? Seeing no one, we will close the public hearing. It's back to the council for discussion. Someone like to offer the resolution so we can have discussion on that?
Offer that, Your Honor.
Thank you, Justin. I'll second that. Thank you. We have a second from Mr. Thompson. Thank you. Council, discussion. Questions for Tom, questions for staff, discussion?
Your Honor, I got a couple of questions.
Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
I'm just kind of curious as to why do we calculate the internal rate of return over 14 years but do the TIF over 25?
Tom, would you like to address that?
Yeah, the internal rate of return when we typically do an internal rate of return analysis, we look at the overall value we calculate the return over, a hypothetical period of time. We want to make sure we're including a period of time for construction, a period of time for the operation of the development, and as well as a hypothetical sale at the end of the period of time that we're looking at the rate of return analysis. So in this case, because we had two phases, we ran a 14-year period because we wanted to capture 10 years of operation for both phases. So that's why we ended up at 14 years. One thing that I should note, when we do that calculation and we look at the hypothetical sale, and the hypothetical sale is really just a mathematical construct for purposes of making sure that we're valuing the asset as well as the cash flow benefits from the project. But when we look at that 14-year period of that internal rate of return analysis, we're pulling in the remaining years of the tax increment revenue that would be realized. So we're pulling into that calculation in that 14th year the value of the TIF revenue stream that would be from years 15 through 20 in this case. So the 14-year internal rate of return, the 14-year pro forma that we looked at, does capture the full 20-year value of the TIF revenue stream. We want to make sure we're counting that and not leaving it out. But when we're doing that internal rate of return analysis, we're trying to make sure we're just capturing a period of time that represents construction of the development, operation of the development, and then the developer selling the development and realizing any profits from the sale. So we've got that full return captured within that analysis. So the 10 years is just kind of it's just kind of a standard period that we typically run these for. In this case, I ran it at 14 because I had two phases. I want to make sure I captured both phases. But most importantly, that analysis is capturing the full 20-year value of the TIF within that number.
Thank you, Tom. Anthony, did you have another question?
Yeah, I got a couple more. I just was also kind of curious as to why is interest included? I mean, it seems like obviously the interest is a large portion of the cost, and also in the other question I got, and then I've got another question after that. But obviously the developer's going to have a cost estimate of $12 million, but we're only having a value of $7.4 million. And is that obviously that's coming from the county? But at the moment, our county property values have skyrocketed, and well, certainly have from a taxation point of view. I'm not sure that they're as real in the world, but property tax dollars have gone up. I mean, this year I had a lot of residents talk to me about their bills from the county, and in fairness, it's not easy to understand how they derive those numbers. But I mean, in a way, why would you build a building that costs you $12 million that at the end of the day is only worth 7.4 the next day? So you're losing almost $5 million when the project's complete. It doesn't make sense from a. But obviously, I understand that if it was a higher value, then there would be a higher kind of potential, tax increment. But it just seems odd.
It does seem odd at face value, but it is very common when we look at non-single family homes for there to be a difference between market value and total construction cost. Whenever we're doing if we're doing a simple TIF projection, we don't have a market value assumption from the county, which we did in this case. But if we're just doing a quick back of the napkin TIF projection, I almost always start with the project cost and take 75% of that. In this case, it came in at a lesser amount based on what the county provided as a value assumption. But there's almost always a spread between the cost of construction and what the county might value something at. In this case, and then for purposes of the TIF revenue projections and for our review, it's almost a benefit that the market value is lesser than the total cost of construction because it's creating a lower TIF budget. If we ran this off of a $12 million project, it would show a higher property tax burden for the project and a greater need for assistance for the project. And it would also result in a greater amount of assistance and tax revenue being captured within the TIF plan or proposed to be captured by the by the TIF plan. So if that amount is less or is a conservative assumption, that's in the interest of resulting in a lower TIF amount and a lower projected TIF revenue stream. So if the value actually comes in at, say, 9 million, that's going to shorten the overall life of this TIF district by whatever that ratio is. So if values come in higher, because we set the TIF amount based off of only 7.5 million post-development value, so that resulted in 1.2 million in TIF, because we set that off that more conservative assumption, that 1.2 million is fixed. That's determined by the TIF agreement and by the development agreement. If values come in higher, that amount gets repaid faster. This TIF district the obligation gets satisfied earlier. Everybody benefits quicker. So it's really in our best interest when doing these projections to kind of hedge our bet and be conservative with that assumption, because it's to the city's upside if that value comes in higher. So that's one of the areas that we try to be conservative. We did include an inflation assumption on this of 1.5% annually to maybe offset some of that. But again, that's the developer's risk. If the inflation doesn't happen at that projected rate, tax increment revenue would be coming at a lower rate, and then they might not get fully repaid. So again, we try to hedge these agreements in the ways that provide the city with the greatest flexibility and the least potential cost. So starting with this, the county provided assumption of 7.5 million estimated market value was actually in the interest of the rest of the development agreement points. And I believe you had another question as to why interest is reimbursed on as it relates to the use of TIF. So the developer is responsible for incurring $1.2 million up front. So they'll get reimbursed from the date that they incur those costs as it relates to the eligible improvements. They're going to have to either use funds out of pocket or they're going to have to borrow for those expenses. So the idea behind reimbursing them for TIF is making them whole for that interest carrying cost that they're going to incur. So because they're going to incur that cost, if we only reimburse for 1.2 million and no interest, because that 1.2 million is going to be coming in over a period of 20 years, the actual value of that revenue stream would be significantly less than 1.2 million in present value terms. So we know that the developer's going to have to come out of pocket or borrow for those funds. So the idea is to kind of essentially, in essence, keep them whole as it relates to their borrowing costs, because they're the ones taking the risk. They're the ones incurring that cost up front. They're the ones that are going to be obligated and have to make any repayment on any debt as it relates to that, particularly if TIF revenue is less. We want to make sure when we're doing that we're not reimbursing them for an interest rate greater than their borrowing rate. We want to make sure that if they're borrowing at 4%, we're not reimbursing them TIF at 5%, because we don't want them to have an unnecessary revenue stream there. So that's why we have that language within the development agreement that says it'll either be 4.25% or their actual borrowing rate, whichever is lesser. We want to make sure that there's not an arbitrage situation here. But the goal is to essentially keep the developer whole for the cost that they're incurring in today's dollars via revenue that's not going to come in for up to a period of potentially 20 years.
Thank you, Tom. Anthony, you have one more question?
Yeah, I was just curious from a city point of view, how many apartment kind of TIF agreements do we have out there that still are to conclude where we're actually seeing the benefit of kind of having had a TIF agreement?
Bill, did you want to answer that?
Anthony, I know I'd have to look it up to be sure, but for sure, let's see, we have one, two,
One by the wall.
and then one behind
The Y.
Target.
The Y.
Yep, by the Y. So
Target.
those three behind, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 to 6 at least that come to mind, buildings. And we've had it on ones also in the past that are since decertified. I think the ones on on Western Avenue, River Bluff, Riverview.
If you could maybe you could put a quick schedule together to sort of show what that is coming back, because it in the 2014 housing study, obviously it quoted that we needed about 115 to 130 something apartments. I mean, and obviously the emphasis on the housing study was more towards individual homes or townhomes. So we'd probably, we've probably maxed that number out plus more. And obviously this is another 70 apartments that we would be adding, to the TIF portion. So I'd be kind of curious to see, when are we actually going to start seeing the actual benefit?
Yep, I'll put something together and email it out to the council.
Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
Mayor, I got a quick
Thank you,
question.
thank you, Bill. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
And just maybe to add on to Bill, if you're going to be looking to Anthony's question, if you're going to be looking to that, obviously it was discussed with market values and repayment and paying it off early. Would it be easy in that analysis of those 5 or 6, where we're at in their schedule? Are we ahead or behind in terms of the TIF when it was went into effect versus where we are for the repayment schedule, if that's easy?
I'll look at that. So your question is, how is the actual TIF coming in compared to what was projected in the TIF plan, right?
Yeah, like to Tom's point, if fair market value comes in at 12 and we only projected at 7, it's going to get paid off a lot earlier than 25 years.
Right.
So on the existing TIFs that we have on the books, are they projected based upon the current market value adjustments we've seen in the last few years with county? Where we're at on the repayment of those notes? Are we projected to pay them off 10 years early, or are we projected for them to run the full term?
Sounds good. I'll
Just
look at
curious.
that.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Justin. Thank you, Bill. So we have a resolution on the floor. Before we call for the vote, are there any other comments, questions from the council, of Tom or of city staff?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make some comments.
Yes, go ahead,
This
Scott.
is Scott Kwame. I'd like to make some comments, please.
Yes, please do, Scott. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to thank Tom for his presentation tonight. I think that this was a good presentation and cleared up a lot of questions for folks. I know it answered some questions for me. I think there's a general sense that TIF is sort of one category, and that we either give TIF to do an incentive or we don't. And the idea or the reality that there are different varieties of TIF for up to 5 different ways that it can be created and managed is an important thing for people to understand. I think in speaking for myself, I would say that I would generally support TIF in all cases as it relates to bringing in jobs to town, bringing in industry, bringing in business. If we have opportunities to do that kind of an incentive and bring in business that would provide jobs, I'm all for it and would be strongly supporting of that. I think there are many that have expressed concern about this because it's going to bring perhaps some jobs, but not one of these large project deals. We're not bringing in dozens or even a great number of jobs likely with this. There'll be some, but it's primarily for housing. And I think there is a reluctance and a sense that using TIF to support housing is maybe not the best use of TIF. However, in this case, with this version, this style of TIF, it's an appropriate use, and I support it. And I think that the definitions that were brought tonight and the explanations help clear that up. When this project was first brought to the council 3 months ago, the vote was 7-1, and I was the one that voted no in that case. And I wanted to explain a little bit as to why that vote was the way it was. For me, it was not a vote to say I'm against this project, because I'm not. I believe that this is a good step in the right direction for the city, and I support the overall project. But what was happening at that time was that there was a sense that people just didn't see this coming, and there hadn't been a lot of oversight as to how the decisions were made. And particularly, there was no involvement from the Planning Commission. There was no replacement plan for the parking that would be lost. And there were some questions that were raised, and within just a couple of weeks of presentation and approval, we had to say we were for it and get this ball rolling. So there was some uncomfortable concerns with how it first got rolling, and perhaps there's a way that we could address those concerns in the future, so that the Planning Commission has a chance to look over things like this, and so that when there's some questions, say for example on a loss of a parking lot by the city, that we've got a way to have those questions answered when the plan is presented. But again, overall, I'm supportive of this project. I think, again, in this case, there's probably some that are concerned with the overall impact to the county, to the school district. And as Tom in his presentation pointed out, the documents for this were presented and sent on to the county and the school district a month ago. So this isn't something that they could not respond to. They certainly could have. Frankly, I would have liked to have heard from both the county and the school district tonight during the public hearing, even if it was to have a short statement of support, just to kind of relieve some questions that folks might have about how this might impact the county and the city. Overall, all this to say, I'd support the project. I think that when it comes to the question of using TIF for housing, this is a bit of a tangent, but just for what it's worth, last week, the RTC Master Planning Committee got together by Zoom, and one of the facts that came up in that presentation was that there's been more studies done than what was just referenced earlier about the need for housing in town, and the studies that were done for that show that there's an ongoing and growing need for more housing in town, and the kind of rental housing that could potentially end up at the RTC, for example, would also fit this situation as far as just needing more rental type housing and housing in general. And so I think this is a good use of a program that's designed for this use, and I'll speak in support of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Any
Your
other
Honor?
comments?
Yeah, this is Tom.
Yeah, Tom, go
you're
ahead.
the other Tom, as I'm known. No, I just wanted to reiterate. I don't know if anybody landed on it specifically tonight, but this project wouldn't have happened without TIF, and the developer, I believe, has stated such. So we need to take a big step back and look at that. I mean, this project is exactly what this city needs. I mean, we want people living downtown. We want people shopping downtown. We want to bring people downtown because that's our future. And so if it wasn't for TIF, this project wouldn't have happened. So using redevelopment TIF in this way is a great opportunity for the city, and I'd like to thank the investors for coming forward and making the project happen, and as well as Tom and city staff and everyone else, and Annie and Greater Fergus Falls that's worked so hard to make this a reality.
Thank you, Tom. Any final comments, questions from the council before we call for the vote?
If I
I
could
just,
Go ahead, Brent.
yeah, I just want to make it known also, I'm in favor of this project as we speak right now. I did have my problems back when we had the problem with the Herzog building, and I made it clear that I would not be in favor of any TIF that did not generate any jobs or anything else like that. But since then, I've had a very long conversation with Mr. Rogness and his views on things, and I've been dealing with Annie Deckert, and the amount of interest from outside businesses coming in. We have some from local businesses that are interested to expand, which would also create jobs. But it seems like there's a lot of outside interest from people wanting to bring their businesses into Fergus Falls too. So as far as I'm concerned, between that and what I see with the little strip mall that was made out in front of Target, every one of those is brand new businesses that came into town. So with that in mind, it took me a while to come around, but I do believe that I'm going to be in support of this with what I see with the amount of out-of-town businesses that want to relocate into Fergus.
Thanks, Brent. Tom, from
Yeah.
Baker Tilly, go ahead, Tom.
One unique thing I wanted to mention as it relates to the school district that's somewhat unique from them, and I can't speak on behalf of this school district, but just the property tax structure, is school districts collect property taxes based off of the normal property tax system that TIF captures, but they also generate property taxes off the market value of the property based on there's a separate market value referendum tax. And in the case of the tax rates for this school district, they actually collect more of their property taxes off the referendum market value based taxes than they do off the local taxes by a factor of almost 70%. So the market value based taxes that the school district collects will still be collected with this development, even if it's in a TIF district. So the school district will collect 70% of the taxes that they would otherwise have received by this project if it were outside of a TIF district. So from a property tax standpoint alone, I can just speak to the math. there's a significant benefit to the school district as it relates to this project because they get most of their property taxes off of something that's not captured by TIF.
Thank you, Tom, for that clarification. And with that, if there's any other questions or comments, we will call for the roll. Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hagberg,
Yes.
Kwame.
Yes.
That resolution is approved. Item number 2, we have a second public hearing for the same project. This is a public hearing related to the Intermediary Relending Program, or IRP loan, and I will call on Bill Sonmore to briefly discuss that with us before we open the public hearing this evening. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, like you said, this relates to the same project, so I won't give any of that summary. This loan has come through Business Development for Fergus Falls and is recommended to you by that board. It is a $200,000 loan. It would be part of the financing package for the project. It would have a 20-year amortization with a 10-year balloon payment, and it would be at an interest rate of 2.5%. Because this is a below-market rate interest rate on a loan, it becomes a business subsidy. So we would be looking for your approval as City Council to authorize the mayor and city administrator to sign the documents for the loan as well as for the business subsidy agreement. There are no wage or job goals included within that business subsidy agreement. They do have to stay in business for 5 years to receive that business subsidy. And then you can see in the memo, too, the other financing agencies, Northwestern Bank making up the bulk of it with the first position, West Central Initiative, $300,000 at a second. The City of Fergus Falls with this loan would be in the third position, and then the owner's equity comes after that.
Thank you, Bill. And with that, we will open up the public hearing. Anyone wishing to speak to this IRP loan for Rivers Edge Development, please identify yourself, state your name for the record, and your comments. Going once, twice. Hearing no one, we will close the public hearing. It's back to the council. Could we get, I guess I would entertain it first before we have discussion, a resolution authorizing that contract between Rivers Edge Development and the City of Fergus Falls. Jim Fish, offer that. Thank you, Jim. Someone like to second that? Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you, Krista. Questions or comments from the council? Hearing none, roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks, Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hagberg,
Yes.
Kwame.
Yes.
That resolution is approved. Thank you to the developers. Thank you, Annie, for being here this evening. Tom, thank you for all the information and all the work on this project. Appreciate everyone's involvement, helping this project move forward. We're excited to see it as an addition to downtown Fergus Falls and the riverfront development. So thanks, everyone that's involved. Moving along on the agenda, there are no bids to award this evening, so we'll move to petitions and communications. Item number 1 is a resolution acknowledging the retirement and 35 years of service of Harold Thorson, and we will read that resolution. Whereas Harold Thorson has submitted his intent to retire effective December 31st, 2020, and whereas Harold began employment at the City of Fergus Falls on November 12th, 1985, and whereas on December 12th, he transferred to the utility maintenance light equipment operator, and on March 26th, he transferred to Park Maintenance 1. He also worked as a light equipment operator from April 11, 2000 to his position as heavy equipment operator in 2017. And whereas Harold became a refuse truck driver on May 1st, 2014, and has remained in that position until the present time. Now therefore, I, Ben Shire, Mayor, City of Fergus Falls, do recognize Harold's 35 years of dedicated service to the city, and we offer this resolution, which was offered by Councilmember Jim Fish, who moved its adoption, and was seconded by Councilmember Justin Arneson, who seconded, and the the resolution was adopted by the following vote. Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hegberg,
Yes.
Kwame.
Yes.
That resolution is approved, and we want to say thank you to Harold Thorson for those 35 years of dedicated service. Item number 2 is an HRA Programs and Grants Award update, and we will call on Michael Olson, who's with us this evening, to give us that update. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Your Honor, council members, city staff. Nice to see everyone, at least on screen tonight. Just a quick update here. I don't want to run through word for word in the letter here, but just as a quick update, the day after I sent this letter to Mr. Bremseth, we received a congratulations from the Federal Home Loan Bank, and our first award here ties directly into our Minnesota Deed Small Cities Grant. That grant remains open in the neighborhood that is surrounded by Channing to Vernon and Oak to Arlington, and we anticipate providing rehab dollars to 20 homeowners in that neighborhood over the next couple of years. Federal Home Loan Bank has approved a loan, or a grant application that will provide an additional $240,000 to residents in cities that we have open Small Cities Development Program grants. And so this will be, in addition to the $25,000 available to homeowners through the Minnesota Deed Grant, there will be additional dollars available through the Federal Home Loan Bank to extend their projects further. On December 17th, the Board of Directors for Minnesota Housing met and discussed applications. 35 applications were included this year that were housing infrastructure bond eligible applications. A little tongue twister tonight. 11 of those 35 applications were recommended to advance, and a project for permanent supportive housing and further also recommended. What I'm reporting tonight is that because the state bonding bill was approved so late, these projects have not gone through all of the feasibility and underwriting that they typically would by now. So we've cleared a hurdle in making it to the advancement process, but we have not been actually awarded yet. And in talking with folks at Minnesota Housing, it'll be March or April before we hear about an actual award. So we'll get through feasibility, we'll get through underwriting, and then there will be awards contemplated, at which time we'll have a little more news to present the city. So it's been an interesting year with COVID and the response, the closures and the inabilities to work with some of the homeowners that we'd like to be working with right now. But I think things have hopefully turned for the better, and I see a lot of good things in the future. So,
thank you.
if anyone has questions, I'll do what I can to answer tonight.
Yeah, thank you for that update, Michael. Does anyone from the council have questions for Michael? Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the work that the HRA is doing, as you mentioned, during these difficult times. You're assisting a lot of people out there, so thank you for the work that you and your staff are doing.
Thank you.
Moving along to the consent agenda, there's 5 items this evening for consideration. If anyone would like to remove any of those items for discussion individually, we can do that at this time. Seeing none, I would entertain a resolution approving the consent agenda as submitted.
I'll offer that, Your Honor.
I'll second it.
Thank you, Justin and Brent. Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes, and just to clarify, I think that was Tom and Brent.
Yeah, sorry, that was Tom and Brent that made the resolution second. My fault.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hegberg,
Yes.
Kwame,
Yes.
That resolution is approved. Under ordinance and resolutions, tonight we have the second reading of ordinance 9, 8th series, amending the zoning map from R2 to I1 for the parcel located at 507 South Sheridan Street, as requested by G&H Holdings LLC. That's been before the council. It's been introduced. If anyone has any questions, we can direct those to our city attorney. Otherwise, we will call for the roll. Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson, Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks, Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hegberg,
Yes.
Kwame,
Yes. Yes.
That ordinance is approved. Thank you. Item number 2 is a resolution on that same property, a resolution approving a conditional use permit as recommended by the Planning Commission for auto vehicle sales. Again, the address is 507 South Sheridan Street, and that's being requested by G&S Holdings LLC. Would someone like to offer that resolution?
I'll offer it.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Scott. We have a resolution and a second. Any questions for staff? Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Yes.
Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hegberg,
Yes.
Kwame,
Yes.
That resolution is
Yes.
approved. Tonight, we have claims in the amount of $631,017.66. If anyone has any questions, we'll direct them to our Finance Director, Bill Sonmore. We have a resolution by Mr. Fish to pay those bills.
I'll second.
Thank you, Krista. We have a second. Roll call, please.
Roofer,
Aye.
Thompson, Thompson,
Yes.
Arneson,
Yes.
Gustafson,
Yes.
Hicks,
Yes.
Fish,
Yes.
Hegberg,
Yes.
Kwame,
Yes.
That resolution,
Yes.
thank you, Scott. That resolution is approved. There are no board, committee, or department reports. There are no reports from staff or administrative officers. Under old and unfinished business, we'll have an update on the downtown riverfront project budget, and we'll call on our city finance director, Bill Sommer. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Your Honor. Excuse me. Before you tonight, you have a memo just highlighting the latest numbers for the downtown riverfront project. We got together with Barry Glinke from Bolton and Mink last week and went through these numbers. So I know we have Barry available as well, and Brian is here at the meeting as well. So looking back, the City Council initiated this downtown riverfront project with PIs 97, 67, and 68 back in January of 2018. So since that time, the City Council has approved the public engagement and design process, and we have expended $842,698.96 as of tonight. These expenditures have all been approved by the City Council, and they'll need to be repaid and funded whether the project proceeds or not. And they are included in the budget listed below on that memo. The expenditures are for design development and the final development phase. We did some testing, lobbying expenditures to get that, the bonding bill passed, and then city staff that have been charged to the project, working directly on the project. That would be more in the engineering-related process. During 2020, the state legislature did approve the $1.75 million for the project within that 2020 bonding bill. And just to note that that funding does require a match of 1.75 from non-state sources. Then at our last meeting, the City Council did approve the submission for that application for the Kern Bridge, and that application was completed and submitted last Friday. So big thank you to Barry and his crew and Brian Ybarro for their hard work on getting that application in. That was great. So then looking down under the budget area, you can see the expenditures. Again, these are the latest numbers here today. For West Block of, 2.7 million, the East Block 1.3, the Kern Bridge relocation at about 3.4. So total expenditures of 7,436,750. So project funding for that 7.4, state bonding of that 1.75 million. We have funding sources from a local trust and then private funding of 1,135,000. The LCCMR grant of 600,000. The federal funds for the Kern Bridge, would be 80% of the eligible expenses on that project of 2,316,000, leaving the city funding portion at 1,635,750. Now I'm pointing out too on the kind of the right side of that scenario the various percentages of funding, and you can see, state bonding at the 23.53, the trusts and the private fundraising 15%, 8% from that LCCMR, the federal funds at 31%, and then the city funds at 22%. So noting too that those city funding sources, now that could be comprised of some different funding sources to make that up. Municipal state aid could be one. Proceeds from property sales. We're going to be looking at having that lot sold adjacent to the Shopco property now this spring. That could get redirected here. And then certainly general obligation bonds, which of course, as you well know, we often do in these projects. And one thing to note too, those private funding sources that would come in, they typically come in over time. So we'd certainly be bonding to carry those costs, and then we'd be making those bond payments with those private funds as they come in. We certainly did that with the arena, do that with the library currently as well. So that's just kind of a high-level summary. Wanted to get back in front of you here, so.
Thank you, Bill.
Leave it at that.
Thank you for that update. Any comments, questions from the council?
Bill, would it be possible to calculate sort of approximately what the effect on property tax would be for obviously like the 1.635 million?
We certainly could do that if, first we would have to make the decision, how much would you bond for? That would be the city contribution portion, and then we would apply an interest rate to it. I know interest rates are currently maybe like 1.75%, so the interest rates are still low.
You could do a simple number of 1.5 million or something, because as you said, obviously you've got the 1.1 million from the trust, or are you thinking 1.6 is not enough?
So I think
if we did a simple number, then we can extrapolate it up or down.
Certainly, yeah.
If you know what I mean, if it was $1 million and it comes in at $1.5 million, and I know it won't be precise to be 1.5 times, but if the effect of $1 million bond, raises raises property tax by X, that's kind of what I was trying to get to understand.
We could certainly look at that. I don't certainly have that in front of me.
Whether we have we might have one from that bond we just did, at least to get an idea of what it costs.
Right.
Other questions or comments from the council? Yeah, go ahead, Scott. Thank you. Go ahead, Scott. Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
Would it be fair to say that So the city spends $1.6 million on this project, but ends up with an asset that's worth roughly $7.5 million, but that's probably a good deal.
You know, I would answer that, and it's probably, I might be a little biased on that, but I think that if, as Bill mentioned, I just want to highlight, and I'll let Bill answer too, but the 22% investment that we have in this project, we've never done a project for 22%. You know, we highlighted the library, the community arena, the dairy property, all those are over 50% investment by the city. So I just want to highlight the fact that we talked about for over the past 4 years, if we're going to do projects, we're going to need to leverage the local taxpayers, and we're going to need to leverage that to get private and state funding. We've done that on that project. So I think, I'm glad you pointed that out, Scott. It's 22%, and we have, you know, 1.75, as Bill mentioned, from the bonding funds, over 1.13 from local funds. So, yeah, 22%. Even the Bigwood Event Center, I think, which was 25, which at the time, well before my time. But we've never done a project that's less than, you know, less than 25%. So I think that I would really applaud staff for the job that they've done in identifying resources and ways that we can leverage the minimal taxpayers' dollars that we have for these projects that we identified. Let's recognize as well that this master plan is over 4 years old, and we've talked for a number of years that we don't want to plan, we want to do. So when we initiated these projects, as Bill mentioned, in February of 18, this has been a long process, but we're at the point where City Council has approved the project to go forward. It's shovel-ready. We've secured the funding, and yeah, it's ready to go. So we've incurred costs. Any business that starts, any public project, any private project, you're going to incur costs to get that ready to go. And so, yeah, we've done that, but again, we've secured funding, and 78% of the project is from non-local tax dollars. So I just want to point that out. Any other questions or comments from the council before we move along? Yes, Justin.
Is there any public comment on
Hey,
this?
Mark, this is a city council member. I think I have the right to speak, so please mute your line.
Go ahead, Justin.
I'm in support of the project. I think it was very well. I was thinking the same thing as Mr. Kwame. You know, any investor puts in 22% to get a 78% return. I think that's a good investment in our community, and we're trying to lighten the tax base, and that's obviously a part of conversation. So I'd like to thank staff. I'd like to thank all the people affected by the project. I'd like to thank the people that privately gave and the trust that gave, and the work that's been by our mayor and city staff. And on behalf of this, I think it's hard to think what this looks like, and it's hard to see what this development's going to do for Fergus, but it gets people excited. And I've talked to a lot of people about this, and yes, we're going to spend a little bit of money, but like in the past, Fergus Falls picks up the slack, and I'm excited to see what this is going to do for our downtown, our riverfront, and the community down there, the business community. And I think